My name is Steve Clemens. There are many new faces here that I don't know. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. I'm very grateful to friends who have helped arrange for Leonard Weinglass, who's going to chat with us today about a very, very interesting case, but I thought I would offer a little bit of a preamble, if I may. I had an opportunity, what was it, about 6 months ago, Leonard was speaking at Howard University here in town, and it turns out that one of our senior fellows' father-in-law was a childhood friend of Leonard Weinglass. And I had a bit of an interest in this case. I wouldn't call it a deep interest, but it was one after a trip that I had made to Havana last year. You couldn't help but notice Cuban 5 stuff everywhere. And I have to admit skepticism when I see any government invest so much in celebritizing any problems. And I have to be honest with that. So while I read about the Cuban 5 and saw them, I wouldn't say that I was immediately inspired, because there's always this concern about various propaganda issues. And when our government does it, I always worry about that as well. But I did want to go hear Leonard Weinglass, and I was sort of, to be quite honest, blown away. He is an iconic figure in the American legal profession. He's a very famous civil rights activist and lawyer. He was a judge advocate in the Air Force, graduate of Yale Law School. But what I saw in Leonard Weinglass talking about this case in which he's been representing these 5 individuals who were arrested, as I understand it, I can't describe the detail as well, but I'm just giving my own take, as unregistered foreign agents in America. I happen to know something about the Foreign Agents Registration Act and FARA, as they call it, if that's in fact what they are. There are lots of people operating in Washington who have not registered as foreign agents who I think ought to be subject to incarceration and indictment in this town and have not. In fact, one of my great frustrations is that we've had so many people who essentially skirt around FARA, and there's such disregard for FARA that it was in many ways an incredibly awkward thing to learn. In fact, this is what these agents have been done. And as I dug into it, one of the other parts about it, and I know there's one individual with which this is disputed, and I don't want to shade information one way or another, but I was surprised to learn that the supposed crime, the alleged crimes, which they'd been charged and I guess indicted, was spying not on the U.S. government, not on national security issues, but on private groups in the United States that were in fact planning militant and terrorist acts in Cuba. And this is very, very interesting because though many of you are in this field a lot more than I am. I was a Japan and Asia guy who became sort of a national security guy. I spent a lot of time with generals and intelligence people. And when you spend a time with folks in the U.S. military who've been there and parts of military simulation exercises, one of the really interesting ones out there, if you talk to anyone in the Southern Command, is that the simulations of what had been considered possible after Fidel Castro's death or after some incident in Cuba was not necessarily revolution in Cuba, but rather 600 small craft, heavily armed, of private individuals from the United States, essentially invading Cuba, sort of a replay of Bay of Pigs, if you will. And one of the things that has at least begun to seep out is that one of the ways in which we watch these activities of American militants based in the United States, which there was a very good article the other day in Salon.com, is that we've identified weapon stashes outside the United States which are being monitored. And this is a serious issue, and if our U.S. military is in fact having classified simulation exercises, worried about the same people engaged that the Cuban 5 were supposedly spying on, it raises certain issues. Leonard will go into this, but there was some exchange of intelligence information between the Cuban government and the U.S. government that actually led to the arrest of these people, in which Cuba was cooperating with us, and it was this information that was passed on that led to their incarceration. One other bit before I get on is, I don't want to identify who, because I don't know if they're in this room. I received a couple of emails the other day, dismayed at our being part of a movement to connect the Cuban 5 issue to the issue of Luis Posada Carriles, who is an alleged terrorist who was allegedly involved with being one of the first to blow up an airline, a commercial airline. And I just want to say for the record, the one that connected those two things and other things was me. I'm unaware of such a movement. I'm not that connected. I am in fact concerned that on one hand you have an individual who may have been involved with terrorist acts who is living freely in Miami today and quite blatant and overt about his activities, and for that not to be an important issue within regard to looking at other elements of our delivery of justice, as it were, to other people in the Cuban relationship. And as I've been down to Havana and as I think about changing the direction of U.S.-Cuba relations, which I think is in American interest to do so, I find it disconcerting that the message that we're sending nationals in Cuba who have their own struggle and own issues with their own justice system, that we're sending signals that we are arbitrary in our justice, that we are subjective to absurd levels in justice, and that we do have this interesting profile. So to friends in the House of Representatives who I think are on trying to do good things, the only one who connected these issues that I know of is myself in an email, because they look so absurd when in fact you compare the rather harsh and absurd penalties imposed against these 5 individuals compared with what's going on with the I think the pursuit of other bad guys in largely Florida who want to cause harm inside Cuba. So that's a long preamble, and I felt it was necessary to do that, and I really am very, very grateful to Leonard Weinglass for being with us today. New America Foundation is a centrist institution trying to think through U.S.-Cuba relations for really a new era, and we try and do so without blinders. We try and do so through objective discussion. Jeff Flake, a Republican congressman from Arizona, who was profiled today in the Washington Post in another capacity, helped launch our forum here, and there is an ongoing. So I look forward. There are many new faces here. Look forward to talking with many of you about our activities and programs down the road. And as people continue to come in, let's make sure that we get chairs put in and just be accommodating everyone. Grab your sandwich when you're coming in, and we'll do it. So please give a round of applause and a good welcome to Leonard Weinglass.
Thank you, Steve, and I want to thank the Foundation for inviting me here this morning. I am a practicing attorney, and I have been for almost 5 decades now, but it happens occasionally, and thankfully pretty rarely, that a criminal case occurs which intersects issues of foreign policy, such as Steve has already indicated. I was fortunate enough to be one of the attorneys in the trial of Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers trial, which I'm sure some of you remember. In that case, in the criminal process, and the trial of Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo, by necessity had to review the 40-year history as contained in the papers between the U.S. and Vietnam. And likewise in this case, which I'm about to speak on, the case of the Cuban Five, by necessity, in court, had to review the 40-year history of U.S.-Cuban relations as part of the prosecution. So I'm here to speak as a lawyer about a criminal case, but it also of necessity implicates issues of foreign policy. And I have to say at the outset, my favorite format for speaking is a debate format. Frequently I debate prosecutors so that people could have both sides of the story in one sitting. I feel like I'm in a position where I'm going to have to give you from time to time, this morning, the prosecutor's version. I have to confess I don't do it as well as my own defense version, but I think you ought to have both sides of this, and I'll do my best to give you that. But I did offer on one occasion at the University of Miami Law School to debate Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General who initiated this case. And she did it at a point in time when she was already contemplating her run for the United States Senate in Florida. So the initiation of this case was on a certain level part of a personal political agenda of the Attorney General who had it in mind to run in an election in the state of Florida where the 650,000 plus Cuban American exiles are a major part of the voting bloc. But I want to talk about this case, and like all cases, you have to begin with the context in which the case occurs. As many of you probably know, since the success of the Cuban Castro government, there have been periodic attacks emanating from these shores on Cuba Of course, the most dramatic being the Bay of Pigs attack. But there have been other attacks over the period of 40 years plus. But they would die down, and then there would be more, and then they would die down. But in the 1990s, as the Soviet Union fell and as the Eastern European countries changed systems, as you know, Cuba was left isolated and in very dire economic straits. Cuba, which prided itself on its making nutrition available to its own people, began to have trouble meeting the nutritional needs of Cubans. The economy fell into such a serious tailspin that there were serious questions as to whether or not the Cuban government could even survive. It was at that point that Cuba, faced with that calamitous situation, decided that it would move in the direction of building the tourism industry as a way of earning quickly hard currency and as a way of bailing itself out of a financial crisis. So they formed partnerships with various hotel groups that were in Spain, in Italy, in Canada, in England, and the tourism industry began to take root. If any of you have been to Cuba recently, you will see there are 4-star hotels, 5-star hotels, magnificent structures, marble lobbies, beautiful decor. All of that recently built starting in the early 1990s as a way out of the economic calamity. At the same time, the people opposed to the Cuban government in southern Florida saw this as an opportunity to finally, once and for all, bring the Castro government to its knees. And so they mobilized again to begin a process of destroying the opportunity of building a tourism industry. As you probably know, tourism depends upon developing a safe, stable environment where people can bring their children to a beach area and enjoy in the safety of a stable environment a vacation without worry or fear. And knowing that, what the exile community did, aspects of the exile community in Florida, is they convened a press conference, and at the press conference they publicly announced that henceforth these groups, which had been trained militarily, former U.S. military people, a lot of National Guards people, they announced that henceforth all of Cuba will be considered a free combat zone or a free fire zone, borrowing the term from Vietnam, which means that anything that moves may be considered a target. And they put that out in a press conference so that news media in Italy and in Spain and in Canada and in England would carry this message so that tourists would be deterred from coming to Cuba for vacation. But in addition to that, they began systematically to launch attacks on the tourist sites. A bomb was found in the new terminal building at the airport. Bombs were found in hotel lobbies. Bombs were found in tourist buses. One bomb, as you may or may not know, exploded at the Copacabana Hotel in Havana, killing an Italian tourist as he sat reading a magazine in the lobby. The famous Tropicana nightclub in Havana was targeted for bombing. And all of these attacks, coming in a short period of time, began to intensify the threat to the Cuban tourism industry. Cuba protested each and every act, pointing out to the United States that these were violations of all the treaties of the UN, that these were acts of terror, that the U.S. had knowledge of these groups. These groups train in camps. They're still there. There was an article in last week's, yes, in Salon.com, where someone visited, and there they were, a group of camouflaged men with AK-47s firing automatic weapons at targets. All of this designed to launch attacks against Cuba. So the Cubans are very upset. They notified the U.S. government of each attack. They even went to the United Nations, and they argued before the Security Council that any country that harbors terrorism or terrorist groups is as guilty as the terrorists themselves, a refrain very familiar to us, since it's what President Bush frequently refers to justify the attack on Afghanistan. But none of it came to any fruition. The United Nations Security Council still has the Cuban motion on its agenda, never been acted upon. And so, faced with this, the Cubans did send to these shores these 5 men, together with others, in order to infiltrate these groups. And they came here in the early to mid-1990s, and they successfully infiltrated these groups. These groups have names like Commandos 4, Alpha 66. They're known. These camps are on local Miami television. No one gets upset with this. All of this is violations of the Neutrality Act, which is a law that prevents any American citizen from engaging in military activities directed against another country with which we are not at war. And so, finally, the Cubans did invite to Cuba in June of 1998 a delegation from the FBI, where the Cuban Interior Ministry presented to the FBI 4 volumes containing information on these groups, naming names, giving addresses, having photographs of the camps. And the FBI stayed for several days, examined the material. They took it back to Washington with the promise that they would get back to the Cubans as a follow-up to this information, presumably to begin prosecutions under the Neutrality Act. Well, that never happened. The Cuban government never heard back from the FBI. And I might say parenthetically, when the FBI did nothing about this, the Cuban government then called in the New York Times and released these volumes to the New York Times. And the New York Times, to this day, has not printed a word out of these volumes. And so the FBI returned to Washington and did not prosecute anyone under the neutrality laws, but they did arrest these 5 who had infiltrated these groups and provided some of the information that was contained in the volumes. And these 5 were arrested in September of 1998, and they have been in prison ever since. One of them serving a double life sentence, 3 of them serving life sentences, one 19 years and one 17 years. They came to the United States without any weapons. The government does not contend otherwise. They committed no acts of sabotage in the United States. Government does not contend otherwise. There were no arsons, there were no injuries, there was no damage done, no threat to national security. On the day that they were arrested, the Pentagon released a press statement saying that they never had access to national security information. And the Justice Department, through the FBI, also released a statement saying that they got no secrets of the United States. Their mission was to infiltrate these groups and to gather information about the groups and to report back to Cuba. On the day they were arrested and before they were arrested, the FBI had gotten into their apartments under a FISA warrant from the Foreign Intelligence Court. They had downloaded their computers. They had 20,000 pages of material of what the reports were that they sent back to Cuba. In these 20,000 pages, the government conceded in its opening to the jury that they had not a single page of classified information. This then became the first case where the government leveled a charge of conspiracy to commit espionage without a single page of classified information. And the 5 faced 26 counts. Most of the counts, as suggested, were failure to register as foreign agents. And I think I can address that a little later. These are relatively minor technical counts. Failure to register is something that happens frequently. I brought with me the case of a fellow named Dumeisi, D-U-M-E-I-S-I, who was an agent of Saddam Hussein, who came to the United States to spy on groups of Iraqis living in the United States who were supporting anti-Hussein activities in Iraq. Very similar to what the Cuban Five did, watching, monitoring, infiltrating. And Dumeisi, after the Iraq War started, was arrested, and he was charged with failure to register. He also had some violations of the immigration laws. He had also lied to a grand jury. He had also given false statements to agents of immigration, and he was sentenced for being an agent of Saddam Hussein functioning in the United States to 3 years and 4 months. And so this case bears no comparison to other cases. I must say, giving in this case life sentences, my client, Antonio Guerrero, who did, and I'll describe what he did, absolutely nothing to affect the national security of the United States, is doing the same life sentence as Robert Hanssen, the FBI agent who compromised 11 other agents who were executed in the Soviet Union. The same life sentence as Aldrich Ames. The same life sentence as Robert Walker, who compromised the Navy's undersea operations to the Soviet Union. All of them giving hundreds, if not thousands, of documents for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to the Soviet Union. Antonio Guerrero, my client, is doing the same life for not having passed a single page of classified information. So the 26 counts contained conspiracy to commit espionage. And as you know, conspiracy, and the government said this to the jury, conspiracy does not require that the crime occurred. The government said to the jury, we have no proof of espionage. That's not what this case is about. What this case is a conspiracy case. Conspiracy is an agreement. It's an illegal agreement to do eventually, as the government said, at some unspecified time in the future, an act of espionage. But we don't have any proof that espionage had occurred. And so it was a conspiracy to commit espionage case. And although the Miami papers all called them spies, the government said we had no proof of spying. But nonetheless, the life sentence was given. The other charges are this failure to register and use of a false name, which is also a crime, which 3 of them did. They used false names. And the other main charge was a conspiracy to commit murder. Well, I said that they didn't harm anyone. Actually, they didn't. What the conspiracy to commit murder charge was about was the shoot down of 2 American civilian aircraft as it was about to enter Cuban airspace, or was already in Cuban airspace. It's a matter of some dispute, with the loss of 4 lives as a result of the planes being shot down. A word about that charge. It was leveled against one of the 5, Gerardo Hernandez. The government really didn't contend he had anything to do with this. He was charged with being in conspiracy with the pilots of the Cuban Air Force who shot the planes down as they were about to enter or in Cuban airspace. Again, there's never been a case like this before. This was totally unprecedented, and he received a second life sentence for a conspiracy to commit espionage. Conspiracy to commit murder. What happened here was that the shoot down of the aircraft was in February of '96, 2 years before they were arrested. And Gerardo Hernandez was the one who oversaw the infiltration of a group who sent those planes called Brothers to the Rescue. In the 20 months prior to the shoot-down in February of '96, there were 25 incursions of Cuban airspace by this group, flying these aircraft over Cuba, dropping pamphlets, dropping little metal coins that encourage people to rise up against the government. The Cuban government protested each overflight. All the protests were introduced into evidence in the case. And they asked the United States government to stop these overflights of their airspace. No country in the world would permit a series of overflights like this to occur, but the Cubans did, fearing an open confrontation with the United States. But nonetheless, they did protest it with the hope that the United States would eventually put a stop to it. And the United States did nothing. The Cubans then invited a retired United States admiral, Admiral Carroll, to come to Havana, and he went to Havana. And he met with the head of the Cuban Air Force, who said to Admiral Carroll, "I want you to go back to Washington and convene meetings in the Pentagon and in the State Department and tell them that Cuba is now prepared to defend militarily its airspace, and that we will no longer tolerate these overflights. But we want you to carry the warning back so that the government will intervene and put a stop to it." And Admiral Carroll testified for the defense in this case, and he told the jury this story. And he went back to Washington, and he met with the Pentagon, and he met with the State Department, and he told them this was going to occur. And he was told that there was nothing they could do to stop these overflights because they emanate from southern Florida, where the congressmen from those districts encourage and back this group, Brothers to the Rescue, and that the FAA or the Pentagon or even the White House could not stop these overflights. And I add even the White House because there was another witness who testified, Ricardo Nuncio. Ricardo Nuncio was the advisor to President Clinton in the White House on issues of Cuban-American relations. And Ricardo Nuncio testified, the advisor to the president, testified for the defense that he had written memos and he had advised that there should be a stop to these flights, but that it all went for naught. And as a matter of fact, a memo was introduced by one of his aides, and in that memo it said, typical bureaucratese, that the FAA better get its all, to use its phrase, ducks in a row, because a catastrophe is about to occur. And indeed, the catastrophe did occur when these planes took off from Opa-locka Air Base, an airport, by the way, a civilian airport, which had other uses. The pilots who flew the aircraft in 9/11 were also training at that airport, at that civilian air base in Florida. But they took off from Opa-locka Airport. They filed a false flight plan saying they were heading to Louisiana. They were flying what the media refers to as Cessna aircraft. Now, when we think of Cessna aircraft, you imagine a small aircraft that's at these small fields all over the country. It wasn't that kind of a Cessna. It was a Cessna that was configured so that you could drop things out of it, and it was a Cessna that was used in the Contra War against Nicaragua, and it was sold by the Contras to a very wealthy person in Texas, who then gave it to the Brothers to the Rescue. And these planes were configured so that you could drop things out of them, and they were Navy surplus planes, and they even still had the Navy insignia, which you could see on the fuselage, which had been kind of rubbed out but still visible. Those were the aircraft that were coming at Cuba. And they took off with a false flight plan, headed west toward Louisiana, reached a point, turned, and went straight for Cuba. They were detected, but they were detected by the FAA in Miami. And the FAA in Miami contacted their counterparts, the Cuban FAA in Havana, and told them that these planes were coming, having broken their flight path, on an unauthorized flight heading for Cuba. Then the Cuban FAA in Havana got on the radio and contacted the lead pilot, a man named Basulto, who testified in the trial for the defense. And the FAA from Cuba said to Basulto, and the recording was played to the jury, "You are entering a military defended zone," as he was approaching Cuba, "turn back." And they didn't turn back. They approached either Pierce Cuban airspace or overflew parts of Cuba and then turned. And as they did that, 2 MiG-25s of the Cuban Air Force were dispatched to defend Cuban airspace, and they shot down the 2 aircraft, killing 4 people. Now, Gerardo Hernandez had nothing to do with this. And the evidence in the case was so shallow that the government, in an emergency appeal, when the case was submitted to the jury, said if the judge instructs the jury as she intends to instruct the jury, we face, these are the words they used, an insurmountable obstacle toward gaining a conviction because we don't have the evidence to show that he was in any kind of an agreement to bring these planes down. And the appellate court refused that appeal, and the judge gave the instruction she said she was going to give, and the jury convicted nonetheless, even with the government conceding under that instruction it didn't have proof to warrant a conviction. Well, how could this happen? I might point out, too, and I didn't mention it, on the conspiracy to commit espionage, the other conspiracy charge, the defense produced General Atkinson of the U.S. Army, General Wilhelm of the U.S. Army, formerly the commander of the Southern Command, who testified to the jury that Cuba poses no military threat to the United States. There was nothing that they could see that posed a national security threat to the United States from what they were doing. And these generals, you've never heard of an espionage case where 2 generals, an admiral, the advisor to the president, all testified, but all testified for the defense. And so the case was submitted and the jury convicted on all 26 counts. The judge gave maximum sentences on all. How could this happen? It could only happen if the case was tried in Miami. Virtually no other city in the United States would there have been a conviction based on that evidence. I'm absolutely certain of that, having looked at the record, 119 volumes of transcript, 20,000 pages of 800 exhibits. It was an enormous case. At the time it was tried, it was the longest trial in the United States at the time. It took almost 7 months to try the case. Did you hear of it at all in the local newspapers or the national newspapers? None except the Miami papers. Can you imagine a case where, and I didn't even mention it, Cuban generals testified, American generals testified, White House is involved, history is examined. The defense put in 35 exhibits showing the damage physically that was done to Cuba by these groups. Some of these groups were subpoenaed, and they came in to testify. They took the Fifth Amendment. One of them acknowledged being on a mission. High drama, no reporting, only in Miami. And to this day, the case isn't really well known, as most of you probably realize. And these men are doing double life sentences and single life sentences in this kind of a case. Well, it happened because the case was tried in Miami, a community of 650,000 plus exiles, which has as its principal political cultural value an anti-Castro kind of orthodoxy. It's a city in which the mayor is Cuban American, all the city council Cuban American except for 2, the county government Cuban American, the head of the U.S. Attorney's Office Cuban American, the owner of the Miami Herald Cuban American, the head of the Chamber of Commerce Cuban American. And I don't mean to imply there's anything wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with this. This is the American experience. All of our immigrant groups gather together and they generate political power and they do develop their own political base. But in Miami, not one of these people, none, not one, would have risen to any position of prominence or power unless they were absolutely committed to the overthrow of the Castro government. So the political culture is a single-minded political culture. We brought in the leading expert in the United States, Dr. Lisandro Perez, who teaches at the Florida State University, leading expert on the Cuban-American experience, the Cuban-American community. And he looked at the record, he looked at the charges, he looked at the 7 days of questioning 168 people in an effort to find 12 who could be fair. And he threw up his hands and he wrote a 17-page affidavit to the court saying the chances of these 12 men as agents, conceded agents of the Cuban government to get a fair trial in Miami is, in his words, absolutely zero. And it did come to pass, it was zero. There were press conferences by the victims of the aircraft on the opening day of the trial. Newspaper articles were found in the jury room which blasted the Castro government. One witness attacked one of the defense attorneys as being himself an agent of the Cuban government. The lead juror, the person who became the head of the jury foreman, he said when he was questioned, he said, "I regard the Cuban government as a communist dictatorship and I'll be glad on the day they're removed." He was the foreman, and because he gave one of the closer to being fair-minded answers. The others agreed with him. There were 3 jurors who came in and said, well, out of 168, 3 jurors came in and said, well, I don't know everything. I guess there are some good things and some bad things about the Cuban government. The government challenged all 3 of them. They were removed immediately. Everyone who sat, who had an opinion in opposition to the Cuban government. And so these 5 Cuban agents were tried in that kind of an atmosphere. We immediately appealed the case to the 11th Circuit, a very conservative circuit. A 3-judge court heard our appeal. They looked at this record, this entire record. They took 16 months. They issued a unanimous judgment saying this case presents a perfect storm of prejudice. And they reversed every conviction, all of them, ordered the case to be tried somewhere else where these 5 can get a fair trial, and we were very pleased. That happened in August of 2005. At the same time, a body of 5 judges from a United Nations group called the Commission on Arbitrary Detentions, they issued their verdict also, all 5 judges, unanimous, that these 5 men were the victims of an unfair process in the United States and should be given a fair trial and a new trial. So we had 8 judges looking at this case, 3 in the United States, 5 in the UN, all of them reaching the same conclusion. And we were very satisfied, and we were looking forward to a new trial when the then Attorney General of the United States, Alberto Gonzales, ordered the U.S. Attorney to appeal that judgment. A unanimous 93-page decision by a 3-judge panel. Those 3 judges had over 80 years of experience on the bench. They were senior judges amongst them. And the government asked the entire 12 judges of the 11th Circuit to take this appeal, and they did. And 1 year to the day, they issued a ruling reversing the ruling of the 3-judge panel and affirming all of the convictions. And they found it wasn't a perfect storm of prejudice in Miami. They found that the trial judge in the courtroom did everything she reasonably could do in order to assure a fair trial. But that is not the standard. The standard is you look at the community, not what happens in the courtroom, because the law knows, and most judges know, that what happens in the courtroom is one aspect of a fair trial, but you can't have a fair trial when the community is inflamed. That's been our law, and the 11th Circuit disregarded it. They wrote an opinion not once mentioning the city of Miami or the nature of that climate in the city of Miami. Just looking in the courtroom, whenever there was a problem, if someone said something or misspoke, the judge would say to the jury, disregard that. Not knowing that these juries had to walk past camouflaged men who were calling for the deaths of the 5 and demonstrating as they walked back to their cars. And while they were deliberating, an episode happened where the TV cameras chased them to their cars and filmed their driver's license and put it, the license plate, and put it on the evening news. Very dangerous thing. America's Watch did a study of only one American city, always studies other countries, but one American city was studied by America Watch. That was Miami, 1994. And they issued a report saying it was unhealthy and unsafe to live in Miami or to be in Miami if you had an attitude in opposition to the political culture and against the Castro government. So the jurors all knew that. As a matter of fact, many of them said, I think I can be fair, but I worry about my children. They're in school. A banker said, I can be fair, but I'd lose my business if I brought back a verdict that wasn't acceptable to this community. And most of you remember the Elian Gonzalez case where the young Cuban boy was returned, where the community rose up as one to prevent his return. And 3 months before a jury was picked in this case, 100,000 people were in the streets of Miami urging that Elian Gonzalez not be returned to Cuba. So that was the atmosphere in which the case occurred. So the circuit, the entire bench overruled the 3-judge panel, reinstated all the convictions. We are now appealing other issues that were not heard the first time we appealed because venue cleared the slate and they didn't have to get to the other issues. Now they're examining the other issues. We argued on August 20th of 2007, last August. The remaining issues are waiting for a verdict from the 3-judge panel. We don't know what they're going to do, but we're waiting, and if we have to, we will go to the Supreme Court on the venue issue and on any other issue that keeps the 5 in prison. They've been in prison since 1998. Now in 2008, we're entering the 10th year of their incarceration. Usually, and I've defended multiple defendants before, when they're incarcerated, they're all put in the same place. The 5 were separated as much as you can separate 5 into maximum security prisons. One is in Texas, one is in California, one is in Colorado, one is in Indiana, one is in Florida. That's how the 5 are doing. 2 of them have not been able to see their wives because the government will not give their wives visas to come to the United States to see their husband. We're still working on that, but the wives have not seen their husbands in 10 years. And so it's a case that you can itemize one issue after another of where the justice system has misfired, where the politics have entered the situation and is still entering the situation. 2 weeks ago, in order to get the support of the Democratic group in Miami, Mr. McCain, Senator McCain, went down to Miami, and what did he say? He said, on that shoot-down that happened in '96, that must have been ordered by Fidel Castro. And Raul Castro was the head of the armed services. He must have ordered it after talking to his brother. And therefore, Senator McCain says, let's have an indictment in Florida of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. That is now an issue in the presidential campaign. So this case is asserting itself into the campaign. And I believe others who are running for the presidency have said no less in order to secure the support of that group in Miami, which does determine the Florida vote, which does determine who is president. So that goes a long way toward explaining the kind of problem that we have as lawyers in litigating a case in an American courtroom with this huge investment of a small minority of the American public making its position clear and having the political power to kind of undermine any fair consideration of the case. So I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Leonard, thank you very, very much. I am not one who, thank you. I'm not one who enjoys very court TV very much, but I think if you had been on it and talking about a case like this, I might watch it every now and then. And I want to underscore one point. In February '96, when these planes were shot down, I worked in the Senate. And I'll never forget, because it was, in fact, the Helms-Burton Law, which passed shortly after the shoot down of that plane. My boss, Jeff Bingaman, I seem to remember Dick Lugar, Chris Dodd, and I think Fred Thompson, though I might be wrong on that, 4th senator, were the only 4 senators to vote against Helms-Burton because the fervor after the shoot down of the plane was so enormous. Before I open up the floor, I would like you to share one other item. I am not a Cuba expert. It's become a hobby and passion as I look at this more, because there isn't a sort of a scary element to it that isn't often discussed. Particularly, I met Mario and Lincoln Diaz-Balart not too long ago in the House. Of course, these are the 2 brothers in the House of Representatives that represent 2 Miami districts. I found it unusual to learn that they were related by marriage, a divorce marriage, to Castro. That their dad was Speaker of the House in Havana before the revolution. That there is an incredible family element. So however you define and look at democracy, I was laughing because Lincoln Diaz-Balart put out a statement at one point protesting Raul Castro's seeming successor status to Fidel Castro, arguing against sort of automatic heirs or transfer of power, which I think he had a point, but I would sort of look at his own case as well. But I think that the interesting question is, you told the story at Howard about Batista's grandson and his role in the Florida justice system. If you might share just briefly that, because I'd like to move to some questions in the floor. But what is the
Just
Batista
briefly,
piece of this?
Yeah, it shows the corrosive effect of all this on the body of the American polity. When a fellow named Orlando Bosch, Dr. Orlando Bosch, applied to the United States for residential status, he being of Cuban extraction, the Justice Department was asked to write a memo and investigate his background. And they did. We have that memo. And the Justice Department concluded that Orlando Bosch is probably the preeminent terrorist of the Western Hemisphere, a man who was allegedly involved in the downing of the first commercial airliner in the Western Hemisphere, a Cuban-American commercial jet carrying civilians, in 1973, in which 76 people died. And he was involved in a number of other episodes. And they said, this is a man who has dedicated his life to terrorist activities. And they, of course, said he should be denied residential status in the United States. Well, he went to see a young lawyer in Miami, and that young lawyer then brought his case to a young man who wanted to be governor of Florida, and that was Jeb Bush. And Jeb Bush then brought the case of Orlando Bosch to his father, who was president of the United States, George Bush. And George Bush Sr. overruled the Justice Department, first time it's ever been done, and ordered that Orlando Bosch be given residency status in the United States, where he still lives. And he walks his dog on the streets, I've been told, and he has a rather normal life, even better than normal. He's given a seat of honor. If the President of the United States comes to speak in Florida, he's seated in the front row. And Jeb Bush then became governor. And about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a vacancy on the Florida Supreme Court. And Jeb Bush, remembering this young lawyer who brought him the case of Orlando Bosch, appointed this young lawyer to the Florida Supreme Court, where he now sits. And this young lawyer is the grandson of Batista, the former dictator of Cuba, now sitting on the Florida Supreme Court because he brought the Orlando Bosch case to the attention of Jeb Bush. So the Florida is corroded by this. The lawyer who represented the families who lost their loved ones in the shoot-down. That lawyer is now the president of the Florida Bar Association. And anyone who's engaged in these activities somehow rises to the top of the power structure within Florida.
Well, it's fascinating. Thank you. Let me open the floor to other questions or comments. Yes, Stuart Schwartzstein.
Hi. This is obviously related to U.S. policy on terrorism. Can we have the mic? And it's my understanding that...
Sure, I'm going to hand you the mic. It will help.
It's my understanding that the reason that Cuba remains on the State Department's list of terrorist-supporting states, and this was explained to me, perhaps not accurately, but by someone who deals with Cuba professionally or officially, because Cuba had provided weaponry to the Sandinistas some years ago. I don't know if that is an explanation you've heard or anybody else here has heard, but it would be interesting to find out.
You know, I don't have any information to respond to whether or not Cuba provided weaponry to the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. You might remember during the Sandinista period, the United States accused the Sandinista government of having MiG aircraft from the Soviet Union. I remember this personally because I went with former Attorney General Ramsey Clark on a delegation to Nicaragua at the time. And when I landed at the airport, I looked around and I said to my hosts, "Where are the MiG aircraft?" And they didn't respond to that. But as I left, I was given a model of a MiG-25, and I was told, "You have the only MiG in Nicaragua." So I can't answer that question.
No, it was a lot longer ago than Libya, for example, now off the list, supported.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can just editorialize, I mean, this is an interest of mine in the national security side. Larry Wilkerson, former colonel in the Marines, and Colin Powell's chief of staff, and I went to Havana together, and we were very interested in this question. And John Bolton, you may remember, I should out Stuart. Stuart was a former member of the Department of Defense, staff member of the Department of Defense. You know that it is interesting, and not having been to Havana or Cuba and trying to go over with sort of an honest eye and look at what you could see, you realized that the issues that John Bolton accused them of, that they were developing bioweapons. And so I actually tried to visit some of the facilities and did. It's interesting because they've got very phenomenal sort of viral vaccine production facilities. A place called the Finley Institute was one of those places that were targeted to some degree by Bolton. And they're developing meningitis vaccines for a strain of meningitis that unfortunately we have no response to in the United States. So it's interesting, these kinds of issues. But at the time, there are many people that I've spoken to, General Jack Sheehan, just a similar case of people in the intelligence, national security area. Bob Hutchings, the former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, currently the diplomat in residence at Princeton University, has also written, he was in the Bush administration, this Bush administration, arguing that one, Cuba should be off that list, and two, we need to open up various spigots of engagement with Cuba. So it is interesting, and the only thing I can tell that Cuba is exporting today is doctors, which is an entirely different story, which we can have another time. But let me open the floor. Yes, sir. I'm going to give you guys the mic because I think it will help the cameras. Normally I wouldn't.
Thank you. Lenny, I would just like you to comment briefly on the fact that the mastermind behind the bombs that were being placed in Havana in the 1990s, Luis Posada Carriles, the man who was in Central America at the time, receiving money from Miami and New Jersey to hire mercenaries to go to Cuba to place these bombs, that this man is now not only free in Miami, but this Sunday will be exhibiting his artwork, albeit of fourth-grade quality, but he'll be exhibiting it in Miami at Alpha 66 headquarters in honor of Jose Marti's birthday. And I want you to comment on the irony of this man being free, the man who came to the United States to combat terrorism being in jail, and to tell us what is going on right now with the supposed grand jury investigation against Posada Carriles in New Jersey.
I just want to take offense at your knocking fourth grade artwork.
Yeah, what you say is true, and Stuart kind of mentioned this during his introduction. The comparison of the cases is incredible. It was Posada Carriles and Dr. Bosch who masterminded the bombing of the Cubana airline. And that's just one. Orlando Bosch fired a bazooka at a Polish freighter that was in the Miami harbor because allegedly it was on its way to deliver something to Cuba. The people around these groups were involved here in Washington with the assassination of Letelier and Toby Moffett. Going back, I was a young lawyer in Newark, and I was asked to defend a young Cuban American who fired a bazooka at the United Nations after Che Guevara had spoke. So,
Did you get him off?
No, the bazooka shell fell short, but I didn't get him off. I didn't take the case, but I remember being called and asked to. So you have, as the America's Watch points out, you have a 40-year history of violence at Cuba and violence here in the United States and violence in Miami. A Miami reporter who suggested in a column that perhaps it's time to review our policy toward Cuba with an effort toward reconciliation, stepped into his car the next morning, started his car, and his legs were blown off. And this is arsons and assassinations and assaults. It happened this week, I think, or Friday or Monday, where a group of Cold Pink demonstrated in Miami against Posada Carriles, and they were threatened by a crowd of 150, and their lives were threatened. They ended up having a press conference in the one place they could have a press conference safely, in the police station. That happened this week or Friday. I mean, this is ongoing, and it's part of it, and these candidates who are running will not even comment on Posada Carriles. Bosch is given a place of honor when they come to speak. And they do have art exhibits. Orlando Bosch has art. He's an artist as well. It's something that terrorists
Can I
take up.
can I just add one short comment here, because I want to make one point that these aren't black and white situations. It's like any presidential administration. I tell people it's a schizophrenic reality. There are good guys, there are bad guys, there are dominant personalities and subordinate. And on Posada, because I have many friends in the Bureau and many friends in the Justice Department, were furious, absolutely furious, with the failure to go after him on the militancy and on the murder charges, and that this thing got dealt with essentially as an immigration violation that got dismissed, as I understand it. And there is a fury among some people who take the time to learn about this situation, where I can't comment on what will happen with the Posada case down the road, although the House of Representatives under Delahunt is investigating this case. I am sure you're involved with that in some way, or at least know about it. But to some degree, I think there are people who are trying to surface these issues and at least look at them in a fair and square way. Let me take some other questions. Unfortunately, I'm going to repeat your question, so don't make it long, because I've been told there's feedback. Is that Holly? Oh, no. I'm sorry. Yes.
I'm Phyllis.
Oh, Phyllis, hi. I apologize. You look so much like Holly Yeager, but
I tried
yeah.
to call it.
That's
Very complimentary.
Yes, Phyllis.
So 2 questions. One, Lenny, if you could, you've mentioned the question of the lack of press and the role of the candidates that are not dealing with this issue. Beyond that, what are the things that you see that might help put this on the agenda, that might help push?
So let me pause here just for the camera. One question is, what would help put this on the agenda more? And second, that's it? Okay. What would help put this more on the agenda?
Well, I think I was on the Situation Room with the
Wolf Blitzer?
Wolf Blitzer, and I debated someone from the community in Miami. And after we were off the air, Wolf Blitzer said to me, "This is incredible. I didn't know this story. This is something worth exploring, and I will get back to you." Well, that was a year ago. And that's what happens periodically. I mean, I did offer to debate Janet Reno at the University of Miami Law School, hoping that would generate something. And she, unfortunately, is not well. And I think the Parkinson's is a problem for her now. So that never happened. But you can't, we almost have to do this on a retail basis, where I gather with 200 or 150 people and we discuss it, and people come away with impressions, but somehow nothing is sticking, nothing is generating a groundswell. Even around Posada Carriles. If you can't talk about the Cuban 5 case, well, what are you going to say about people who brought down airliners? And there were processes. These people were prosecuted in Venezuela. There's a record, and there's a Justice Department record. And there are people who are upset with this. I know, and the grand jury is still sitting in Newark without having yet voted out any indictments. And so these things are happening, but no one is putting it all together. No one is putting all the pieces together. There's very little discussion.
It's a novelty case. It's a boutique case that if you're a Cuba groupie, you will avail yourself of it, or if you're interested in, there might be an Atlantic Monthly article or something at some point, and a certain, but you know, I think it's going to take something more to generate substantial interest. Blake?
It is the attitude toward Cuba. I was in London last week, and the Parliament invites you to come speak to the Foreign Relations Committee, and the Guardian paper in London puts a very long spread on the case. And the reaction in any other country is totally different than what we get here. But you're right, things have to be developed on an organized basis. People have to be made more aware. But it's very hard to get traction on an issue.
There are some great journalists in this room. I see Tom Olmsted at the back, Blake Hounshill here in the front. I'll give you like a hint. The week after I was in Havana, Bill Keller of the New York Times was visiting again to meet with the foreign ministry down there. And there were some articles in the New York Times about the Cuban 5, but none that referenced the materials that were passed off. One interesting, Blake can call Bill Keller and say, what did you do with the stuff? Be interesting for foreign policy to do that. Tom, since he preceded you at Foreign Policy many years ago, I'll let Tom ask his question and then come to Blake. Tom Olmsted?
Thank you. Can you just briefly describe, I mean, to the degree that there is any organized effort, either from the Cuban interest section or from interested American groups or individuals, what does the landscape look like to try to bring this case to wider public attention and political attention as well?
So the question is, again, similar to the last, but you know, is it the Cuban interest?
Can you give us a sense of who's taken a particular serious, enduring interest in this case?
So who's taking a particular enduring interest in this case, reflecting on the activity of the Cuban interest section, or whichever groups?
There is a group called Free the Five. They have a website, freethefive.org. They are a group that's clearly on the left. They try organizing and mobilizing, but they're marginalized politically, but they're doing their best. They arrange for people to come and speak at universities. I've been to law schools very often where there are discussions in the law faculty and amongst law students, just from the point of view of the American legal system. But I can't say, I mean, the interest section and the diplomatic corps in Cuba, from Cuba here, are of course circumscribed by travel restrictions.
Has the American Society of International Law ever done anything, ASIL?
No, not that I'm aware.
And is there a reason why they haven't?
I don't know why they haven't. But the UN, as I mentioned, the Commission on Arbitrary Detention has got involved, and Judge Guzman, the judge who prosecuted Pinochet, came to hear the arguments in Atlanta last August, and he's now invited me down to Chile, where I'm going to speak at various law gatherings. But the International Association of Democratic Lawyers has taken a position on the case. They're on the left. I've been able to make a presentation before the American Trial Lawyers Association at their annual convention in Boston. That's the group that's largely behind the Edwards campaign of trial lawyers. So we've tried that. The The American Bar Association has not. The National Lawyers Guild, of course, has a group of around 4,000 lawyers. But there hasn't been major breakthroughs, but there have been pinpricks along the way, various groups.
You have any interest on Capitol Hill?
Pardon?
Any lawmakers taking an interest in the case?
Well, I think Congressman Delahunt has.
Delahunt is investigating it now.
Investigating the Corriles.
Well, he's investigating Posada. I don't know what he's doing with Cuban 5. My sense is they're staying away from Cuban 5 and looking at, I'm not sure, so I don't want to speak to it, but my sense is that Delahunt is very interested in Posada and has Cuban 5 on hold, perhaps, disconnected.
We're still in court, so
Yeah.
I can understand
Right.
a reluctance. We could win in the 11th Circuit, and then
Yeah.
that will end it. But so I think Congress is a little reluctant.
Lot of hands up. I will, give me a moment, but I told Blake he was next.
Okay. Hi, Blake Hounshaw with Foreign Policy. I spoke with a guy who's head of a Cuban-American business group a few months ago. Carlos Saladrigas is his name. Anyway, I got the sense from talking to him, but I don't have a sense of the context, that the Cuban exile community in Miami is become a lot more fragmented and become a lot less unified in opposition to Castro in the same militant way.
All polling shows that,
Yeah. So do you get the sense that there is a political environment that's changing that could, help with the case, or at least publicizing the case?
You're right. On the grassroots level, particularly amongst the young Cuban Americans, they are breaking away from the monolithic position of the old-timers. The old-timers have all the positions of power. Obama addressed this in his campaign and received much heavy criticism, but he was reaching past those leaders to the community of young Cuban Americans who would agree with him that at least the travel restrictions ought to be reviewed and somehow the burden that's put on the Cuban Americans for the right to visit should be alleviated. And so there is that. We had a full-page ad in an attempt to generate interest in the case. This group, freethefive.org, purchased a full-page ad in the New York Times. It cost, I think, $52,000 for that one full-page ad. And the largest contributions in support of that ad campaign came from the Cuban-American community in Miami, $10,000, which was raised amongst the young, indicating that they were very much in our corner and supportive and backing us. So I presented in terms of the venue and judgment on this case by a jury as a monolithic influence, and that's what the appellate court did find, the three-judge panel. But when you get a little below that and you talk about attitudes toward the Cuban government per se, there are differences amongst the young.
I just want to add, it's not just the young. On the Cuban American National Foundation a few months ago, we had a conference on this, and we had the former general counsel, the former executive director, and a former board member, all two very elder generation and one sort of I hate to say I'm mid-age, but Cuban American National Foundation staff that had changed, so it is getting around further. Yes, I'm gonna cluster a couple of talks here. I think it's the only way we'll be able to do it and get through. So.
Thanks. Len, when you were litigating the venue issue in the Court of Appeals, did you have amicus brief support from the ACLU or the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers or other groups that would have been extremely interested in preserving your precedent on venue, which would have become the leading case in support of defendants' rights on the issue in the U.S.?
Hold just a moment. Let me get a couple more questions here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, you were mentioning earlier the heavy implications of former Attorney General Alberto Gonzalez in the case, and I was wondering if you have noticed in your contacts with DOJ or in the case any change now that there's a new Attorney General, and what are your prospects in the case, regarding the case, with the new administration coming next year?
Good question. I saw another hand over here. Oh, yes.
I wanted to ask a question more on the personal angle. Have you been able to talk to any of the Cuban Five lately? Do they still have any hope of being released?
Thank you. And let me just get one more. Yes, sir.
question also specifically on the U.S. Attorney's Office. Do you have any, tell us anything a little bit about the personal contact with the lawyers on the ground in the U.S. Attorney's Office working on the case? The office has been known as being a very active office, politically connected office beyond this administration and for a time on. Any idea of you know, the atmospherics? Are there breaks in the feeling on prosecuting this case, and how did that go?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, just one line to answer. With respect to amicus, the National Jury Project filed an amicus brief on the venue issue, particularly the jury and the jury selection. The National Lawyers Guild filed an amicus brief on the question of venue. A professor of law at Utah Law School filed an amicus brief on the issue of the necessity defense, which was raised in this case, which I didn't discuss, but was rejected by the trial court. The necessity defense, I don't want to go longer on this, it's a technical defense. It says that, yes, I violated the law, I did not register, I used false names, I committed technical violations of the law, but the jury should have the opportunity to excuse those violations if I was motivated by an interest in preventing a greater harm than those violations created. And that's the necessity defense, a time-honored defense in the United States, rarely used, should be used more often. The judge struck it. The University of Utah Law School filed their brief, a very long, a very good brief. The court refused to even accept that brief. It accepted the brief from the National Jury Project and the National Lawyers Guild, rejected the brief from the University of Utah on the necessity defense. If we go to the Supreme Court on venue, the United States Supreme Court has not heard a venue challenge that they've written about in about 40 years. There are people who think they will hear this one. And we have the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, National Jury Project, National Lawyers Guild, and the American trial lawyers, we hope, maybe even the American Bar, lining up with us on the venue challenge if we have to go to the Supreme Court. That's where we are in amicus. To answer your question, we have no communication from the Casey administration and the Justice Department. I don't know what their move will be should we win this round in the three-judge court. I have to say that our three judges, very esteemed senior judges, who wrote this 93-page unanimous decision, one of them has retired. As a matter of fact, the lead judge, Judge Oaks, from the Second Circuit. He was on loan to the 11th Circuit. He's retired, and they have replaced him with Judge Pryor. Maybe some of you have heard of Judge Pryor. Judge Pryor, yes, when the Bush administration appointed 9 judges to the Courts of Appeals, Senator Kennedy and others filibustered because of the nature of those judges and their histories. They were withdrawn. Senator McCain worked out a compromise with his Democratic colleagues. They agreed that 3 would be put forward and approved, and the 6 would be pulled back. One of the 3 who was put forward was Judge Pryor from the 11th Circuit, and he made it that way. And I have to say, the Atlanta Constitution, when he was named by President Bush, the Atlanta Constitution editorialized about that appointment, and the editorial was headlined, "Right-wing zealot not fit to judge." Now Judge Pryor is sitting on this case. So that's been the change. No change from the justice.
Does the judge know your thoughts on this?
No.
And this lady's asked if you had been in contact with the Cuban Five.
Yes. I'm regularly in contact with them. It's difficult to visit because you have to take 10 days off and circle the country. But I intend to see Fernando, who's in Indiana, probably within 2 weeks. My client is Antonio Guerrero. He's in Colorado at the infamous maximum prison in Colorado in Florence. And I haven't seen him in months, but I hear from him regularly. He is, some of you may know, is a published poet and an artist. He's a rather talented individual who's been locked away for these past 10 years. But I do hear from them, and they're strong, they're well, they are totally dedicated. There are no complaints from any of them, including when they were cast into maximum security isolation cells, which they were for a period of about 30 days. Unfortunately, got them out of that. But they're all very strong and well and in good health.
I mean, this gentleman had a question, but why? What is the precedent for that? Why would you take people who weren't arrested with guns? And I mean, I don't understand the imposition of. I'm not a legal guy, but
No.
but why would you do that?
What must have happened is after 9/11 happened, someone in the Bureau of Prisons or in the Justice Department looked at the people who were inmates and what their charges are. And anyone who had espionage-related charges was put into isolation so they couldn't communicate to whoever the other terrorists are out there. And they put the 5 in that position. Gerardo Hernandez...
So there is a logic.
That's the only thing I could figure out. I went around to visit them. I talked to the wardens. The wardens shrugged their shoulders and said, all 5, they've been in now a total of almost 50 years, if you add it all up. There is not a single write-up against any of them for any infraction of prison regulations. They all have absolutely clean records. The wardens shook their shoulders and they said they came from Washington. We have no beef. They're all model prisoners, but we were ordered to put them this way, and it took about 30 days. There was an international uproar. Even Congress was going to hold a hearing on what happened with them, and in the face of that, they released them back into general population in maximum security prisons where they are.
And then this gentleman asked about the U.S. Attorney's Office.
There's been a change in U.S. Attorney since the case has happened, but they still are an intransigent lot. They speak for the community. They are a highly politicized office from what I can see, and they're wed to that community. And it's very hard to move them to get cooperation with them. I'm up here in New York. Because of that, my colleagues, there are 4 lawyers involved with me. My colleagues are all Miami-based. They won't even talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. The feelings are so hard since the trial. And so I'm the one who usually gets in touch with them because I wasn't a trial lawyer in the case. I'm just on the appeal. And so I do talk to them, but it's all out of Washington. They're under orders, and they're close to that community. When the 3-judge panel wrote their 93-page opinion, setting aside all the convictions, if you get that opinion and you read it, you will see something that you have never seen in any other opinion written by an appellate court in the United States. The last paragraph is an apology to the community of Miami, that the court meant no harm to Miami. It didn't mean to demean the city, and it wanted its citizens to know that it decided this case on the basis of the law, and that was the main concern, and it was very apologetic to a community from the 11th Circuit, which sits in Atlanta, saying to Miami, we want you to understand, we don't mean to cast any aspersion on your community. That's how powerful it is, that even an appellate court writes an apology when they vindicate constitutional rights in a venue decision to the community that is so hostile and so biased against the accused. Now, that's never happened before. But the U.S. Attorney's Office is part of that milieu, as is the FBI. And so we can't break through that crowd. Whether a new administration with the new U.S. attorneys, new Attorney General, whether they will want to take this on, they will have to take it on knowing that it will cost them in the next election, and they'll have to be willing to write off whatever harm comes to their political futures by doing that. You can't move. There is no movement. in this. There was a former chief of staff of the Cuban military, a fellow named Del Dio, came to the United States. He defected. He had a disagreement, a falling out. He came to the United States, hailed as a hero, the chief of staff, a man very close to Fidel, came to live in Miami, and he's been living in Miami, and he is a hero. And he wrote about a month ago that perhaps it's time to review the anti-Cuban policy. And on the radio, there were calls for his...
Do we know he's not a Cuban agent?
That's it. On the radio, there were calls for his execution. Public calls on the radio that this man should be executed. And he has now filed a civil suit in the Federal District Court of Miami against the radio station and the people who publicly called for his killing. So that there's very little give on this. Maybe there are some changes and maybe some people, but the people who are in control of the show are very myopic on this, and it's very hard to move against them. Obama took his licks for saying that the embargo ought to be somehow modified, at least to allow Cuban families to visit their relatives. And he was excoriated in the media for that.
I think he was praised too in some quarters. I mean, I just want to, in conclusion, I want to thank Len, but I want to also make the point about why I find this interesting. Tom Olmsted raised the question about the Cuba intersection of Cuba. And there's just, you walk around in Cuba, this is everywhere. I mean, it's a national cause, and thus, as I said, I was suspicious. And then as I dug into it, I just found it's the weirdest legal case involving national security issues from someone who, in my own experience with Soviet issues, various national security issues, my father was essentially a spy. It was just strange and rang very differently. But this issue, and I want to raise it, there may be some people here who see the world differently than I do, and there's some bloggers here. I launched with my team the Havana Note, and I began blogging about Cuba issues, and I've been called some pretty bad names in my writing career, but I've never been as seriously threatened physically or my life until I got into this issue, which probably hardened my resolve not to be taken out of it. But the level of hostility from Americans engaged in this. But that said, and I want to conclude on this, there is a diversity among the elder generation Cuban American community that is underestimated. There is a demographic and generational diversity, which has been reflected in recent polls. There are interesting caveats like these general. I mean, you can't find a military leader of the Southern Command who doesn't find this silly. And part of the unwritten side is, as tense as this issue is, the backdrop, which no one wants to write about, is there's extraordinary cooperation between the United States and Cuba around Guantanamo. There's extraordinary coordination at one level, at least a one-way level, where the Cubans regularly give us information on boats and ships and drugs locally. We don't return the favor to them. I met the military attaché at our American Interest section down there, a young Coast Guard guy, who is loved in the Cuban military. This is never written about because of the fear that it will rile up the Miami community. So there's a lot of unwritten stuff in this arena that seems not to be poisoned by this legal case. But it is a bizarre manifestation of, I think, a holdover of kind of Cold War, permanent Cold War thinking, and I think it's very important to expose it. So with that, I want to thank Len Weinglass. I want to thank all of you for being with us here today, and hopefully we can play some role in helping to raise the profile. Thank you very much, Len.